The unique culture of the 1970s stems from the major change in both domestic and foreign policy. The end of the Vietnam War and the transition of power between liberal and conservative would morph the culture of that decade. Prior to the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, much of the culture of the 1960s, such as hippie culture, continued as seen in anti war protests. These ideas would be portrayed through music in the many anti government sentiments found in 1970s music. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's song Ohio encapsulated the social climate at the time, especially as it was released just weeks after the Kent State Massacre.
Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. For dead in Ohio. Gotta get down to it. Soldiers are cutting us down. Should have been done long ago. Wanna give you her hand, find her dead on the ground. How can you run when you know?
Ohio was written in response to the violence at Kent State. The mindset entering the decade focused on independence from the government, especially after Johnson's liberal administration. Americans heavily protested governmental involvement both domestically and abroad. They were wary of an incursion into their rights by an increasingly powerful federal government. With the end of the Vietnam War, American social movements could refocus on domestic issues. Hall of Fame rock band Pink Floyd embeds their album Wish You Were Here with progressive views on mental illness. The status quo on mental health at the time portrayed mental illness as a dangerous disease. Often, individuals were seen as unstable or dangerous, as portrayed in popular media and horror films.
Remember when you were young? You shone like the sun. Shine on, you crazy diamond. Now there's a look in your eyes, like black holes in the sky. Shine on, you crazy diamond. You were caught in the crossfire of childhood stardom, blown on the steel breeze. Come on, you target for faraway laughter. Come on, you stranger, you legend, you martyr, and shine.
The typical early 1970s mindset on mental illness would advocate the imprisonment of people with mental conditions. They were often seen as untreatable and as a result of personal shortcomings. Causes of mental illness, such as childhood trauma, were rarely noted. Pink Floyd views mental illness in part as a result of external circumstances, not solely due to genetics. They mention childhood trauma and stardom as causes of mental illness in their music. The 1970s film industry shifts due to the political atmosphere of the era. Hollywood expanded into new genres such as horror, starting with The Exorcist in 1973. Horror movies in the 1970s generally focused on a dark presence that preyed on humanity. In addition to The Exorcist, horror films like Jaws continued this theme. Filmmakers began to explore darker themes in film. Movies such as The Godfather, which portrayed crime, was unprecedented, and as 1960s films rarely mentioned dark or taboo themes which arose in the following decade.
An iconic car of the 70s was the Stutz Blackhawk. With gold-plated trim and more than 15 coats of paint, this vehicle was popular among famous celebrities such as Elvis and Lucille Ball. This is probably one of the most problematic cars of the 70s. Due to its barely protected fuel tank, the Ford Pinto was notorious for spontaneously combusting. Moreover, the Pinto's doors were prone to jamming shut in car crashes. Yikes. In fact, there were so many fatal accidents involving this car that Ford decided to pay the settlements rather than change the car's design. When America Motor Corps advertised this car, their slogan for it was, "When you buy any other car, all you end up with is today's car. When you get a Pacer, you get a piece of tomorrow." The AMC Pacer was indeed non-traditional. Touted as the first wide small car, the Pacer featured asymmetrical doors and a rounded fishbowl-like shape, a design that deviated from the typical three-box design. In the beginning of the 70s, Brady Bunch, a series about a family of 6, was a popular sitcom and lasted for 5 seasons. However, due to the changing societal climate, the 1970s overall saw a decline in wholesome family sitcoms and a rise in socially conscious programming. Programs like MASH focused on topical conflicts like the Korean War, while the sitcom All in the Family talked about controversial topics that had been previously deemed unsuitable for TV. Racism, homosexuality, women's liberation, abortion, and the Vietnam War. By the mid-1970s, viewers became tired of socially conscious programming. During the mid to late 70s, shows involved sex appeal and body humor to gain popularity among audiences. A famous example of these racy programs, coined Jiggle Television, was Charlie's Angels. Game shows like Let's Make a Deal and The Price is Right gained popularity during this era as well. From the music scene, band members of Queen, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, and Led Zeppelin were celebrities. During the 70s, Elton John and Elvis were also common household names. From Hollywood, John Travolta, Clint Eastwood, and John Wayne were popular. TV show celebs included Cheryl Ladd from Charlie's Angels and Jodie Foster from Disney's Napoleon.
The 1970s was an eccentric mix of new and old. Both men and women used fashion to express themselves with bright colors and new textures. In the early 70s, the 60s hippie movement carried over a lot of influence. Midi skirts, maxi dresses, frayed jeans, tie-dye, and peasant blouses were all found, along with jewelry made from natural items. Women in the early 1970s either wore hippie movement dresses or more classy styles. The dressy styles had pastels, dresses with fitted tops, tight t-shirts. Men in the early 1970s wore bright colors, textures, with ruffles, lace, and satin. In the mid-1970s, the hippie look was out of fashion. Men and women both wore more casual outfits, like fitted t-shirts, elaborate designs, slogans, and sport logos. Women began to enter the workforce, so they also had a more tailored business style, with thin blazers, midi skirts, fitted blouses, and heels. Men's suits were more European with straight legs. In the late 1970s came the disco. This came chunky shoes, sequins, high-slit skirts, and more baggier clothes, more revealing pantsuits, tube tops, jean shorts, and earthy tones. Men wore three-piece disco wear, sportwear, tracksuits, jumpsuits, and had pop collars. There were a lot of fads in the 1970s, with the most famous one being disco. Musicians such as Bee Gees, ABBA, and Donna Summer, and movies such as Saturday Night Fever became famous off this trend. Another trend was afros. The Black Power movement of the 1960s to 70s and the term Black is Beautiful increased the amount of afros because afro was a symbol for African Americans that they loved their community and their culture. The afro was also a way to show solidarity towards African Americans. Roller skates were another trend. By the mid-1970s, thousands of roller skate rinks had opened up, many of them disco-themed. Another big trend is pet rock. After California's Gary Dahl began selling boxed pet rocks in 1975, they became a hit, and soon he was making millions off of making $1 for every $3.95 rock he sold. What did people do for fun in the 1970s? With disco and roller skating also came Saturday cartoons, going to the cinema to watch movies such as Godfather and Star Wars, listening to music on record players and stereos, playing games on game consoles, or playing games such as Scrabble. There is a survey on this slide from the 1974 newspaper with the most common pastime activities from the mid-1970s. A lot of them are not a lot different from what we do now. Also, while people were watching their pet rocks grow, other people watched their sea monkeys grow and saved newspaper comics on Silly Putty.